This is the Institute for Torah and Horaah, International Base Horaah Institute for Dayanim, Torah and Horaah, Parshas Vayechi 5784. This is issue number 690, and the question is, how does Halacha define stepchildren? Are they considered full children, half children, and for what purpose? What kind of relationship does the step-parent have vis-a-vis his stepchild? If a will bequeaths assets to my son Avraham, who is a stepchild, is the will invalid? Can one use his stepfather's name to be called up to the Torah or sign a contract? Can a pseudonym be considered halachically permissible? Of this and more in the coming article. Serach Bas Asher, Stepchildren in Halacha. This week's parsha describes the final days of Yaakov's life, when he blessed his children. The 12 tribes' blessings were also their personal mission. Interestingly, before blessing his children, Yaakov blesses Ephraim and Manasseh, his grandchildren, as if they were children. Indeed, Ephraim and Manasseh are counted as 2 of the 12 tribes. Last week's article discussed Serach, Asher's adopted stepdaughter, who was counted among Yaakov's 70 descendants who traveled with him down to Egypt. Serach is the classic example of the stepchild, leading to last week's discussion about stepchildren in Halacha. This week, we will conclude the topic. Adopted children were previously discussed in this space in the article on Parshas Vayechi 5780. Who was Serach? Last week we noted the Ramban and many other Rishonim, Bamidbar 26:46, cite the Targum Onkelos, who writes that Serach was Asher's wife's daughter from a previous marriage. He explains that the Torah names her Asher's daughter because he was the one who raised her. Rabbi Yochanan Luria, an early Ashkenazi Rav Yeshivas Nefesh Bereshis 46:17, disagrees with this approach. He proves his opinion from the Gemara, while it mentions many sources to prove that an orphan goes by his step or adoptive parent's name. Serach is not one of the names on the list. Therefore, this proves that the Amoraim in the Gemara saw Serach as Asher's biological daughter, contrary to Onkelos' approach. However, the poskim who follow Onkelos' approach refute this proof, arguing that the Gemara was referring specifically to orphans with no biological ties to either of his adoptive parents. Therefore, Serach does not qualify for this list because she was Asher's wife's daughter. Stepchildren always take precedence over adopted children, even if they were not raised by the step-parent. For example, an older child who has already grown up and left home. Since stepchildren have a halachic relationship to their step-parent, when derive laws concerning raising other people's children, concerning raising other people's children, the Gemara had to bring examples of from adoption of total strangers and could not cite Serach. The Gemara in Sanhedrin 28b discusses the question of relationships. Are a wife's relatives halakhically considered one's own relatives? The Gemara asks, how could the pasuk write, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother, you shall not come near his wife, she is your aunt"? Vayikra 18:14. When the wife of a father's brother is not an aunt, but an uncle's wife? The Gemara answers that this proves that a relative of either spouse is a relative of both. As a result, the Gemara determines that when a person is invalid as a witness or judge due to family ties, his spouse is invalid as well. And if an aunt cannot be a witness for her nephew, neither can her husband. This halacha appears in the Shulchan Aruch, Choshen Mishpat 33:3. The Ramah response of 95:6 writes that although the Rivah reads a dispute in the Gemara if a husband's relative is also his wife's relatives, or if the wife's relatives are also her husband's, most poskim maintain, and Halacha follows this majority opinion, that both spouses' relatives are considered relatives, and the Gemara does not disagree on this topic. Therefore, a wife's daughter is halachically also considered her husband's daughter, just as an uncle's wife is halachically considered an aunt, a mother-in-law is halachically seen as a mother, and father-in-law a father. Promissory note for a stepson. Is a promissory note written out for my son Avraham, or a will bequeathed to my son Avraham, considering valid when the said son is really a stepson? The Maharam of Rothenburg, Chuvos Maimoni, Mishpatim 48, discusses this question and validates this bill, allowing the writer to call his stepson my son for 3 reasons. Number 1, people tend to call people they love my son. As Shlomo HaMelech writes in Mishlei 4:20, my son, hearken to my words. And Naomi tells Ruth, her daughter-in-law, my daughter, I must find you a home. Ruth 4:1. One who raises someone else's child is considered having given birth to him, Sanhedrin 19b. One's wife's child is considered his own, even if he didn't raise him. A husband and a wife are one unit. Therefore, his wife's son is considered his own child. The Ramah, Choshen Mishpat 42:15, therefore, accepts a note, bill, or will in which a stepchild is called a child. The Levush in Choshen Mishpat 42:15 and Tumim follow suit. The Knesset HaGadolah notes in Torah 42 and 75, though limits the validity of this note only to the situation where there is no other son besides the stepson. However, when there are biological sons, a note dictating funds to my son cannot be considered valid or directed to a stepson. Rabbi Akiva Eger glosses on Choshen Mishpat 42:15 cites the source. The Tumim, Urim 42:47, disagrees with the Knesset HaGadolah since the Maharam's reasons remain in place, whether or not one has biological children or not. He agrees with the Knesset HaGadolah only if there is a biological child with the exact same name as the adopted child. But some Sofer, in something EH 176, rebutes, maybe it's Eben HaEzer, possibly, rebuts the Tumim and explains that only when there are no other sons can my son refer to a stepson. Otherwise, how could one ensure his will is carried out if he has other children who will step in and demand a share? When only one has a stepchild, this sort of will ensures one's inheritance goes to him and not to his halachic heirs, who are only his father or brothers. The Chidah, Chaim Shaol 141, discusses a testator who bequeathed money or other valuables to my son without mentioning his name. So we're on time here. Getting close, okay? Without mentioning his name, when he has only a daughter besides his grandson, adopted son, or a son or spouse from a previous marriage, whom he never raised, he rules that in all these situations the son can refer to these relatives, proving his opinion from the following sources. Calling one's only daughter my son is acceptable, as we find the Beis Yosef and Mabit. All of one's children, both male and female, are called sons. Therefore, one who doesn't have a son might still call his daughter my son. A son-in-law can also be referred to as a son, because a husband and wife are one unit. A grandson can also be referred to as my son. The Gemara in Yevamos 62 rules that grandchildren are like children. An adopted child can be called my son. As we see from the Gemara Megillah 13a, Sanhedrin 19b, an orphan raises is considered his own child. Stepson from one of the spouse's previous marriages can be called my son, despite not having raised him. This we learn from the Torah's calling Sarah Asher's daughter, despite being his wife's daughter. As for raising her, the Ramban seems to indicate that she is called Asher's daughter only because she was his wife's daughter, and not because he raised her. The Chassam Sofer, in Volume 3, Chapter 76, was presented an interesting question. A man in a certain town was known as Avraham ben Eliyahu. This was how he signed his name, and this was the name he used to be called up to the Torah. One day, Avraham announced his plans to marry his father Eliyahu's sister, a severe Torah prohibition. The local Rabbi Meir, called Eliyahu, Avraham's father, and asked him how he could permit his son to transgress such a severe prohibition. The father answered that Avraham was not his biological son, but rather his wife's son from her previous marriage. But when he married her, her son decided to go under his stepfather's name for convenience's sake and to prevent uncomfortable questions. Rabbi Meir presented the question to the Chassam Sofer with several questions born of this situation. Is one's own testimony reliable to announce that his son is not his biological child, to allow him to marry one of his relatives? The rabbi claimed that the father had done wrong in misleading people to think Avraham was his son when he called him Avraham ben Eliyahu, while it was not true. While the Chassam Sofer answered that calling an adopted child by his adopted father's name is not prohibited, the Torah does in several places, as Sarah was Asher. The proposed marriage between Avraham and Eliyahu's sister remains prohibited for other reasons. The Minchas Yitzchak, chapter 549, maintains that hiding one's biological parents is wrong because it can lead to violation of Torah laws. The Torah wants people to know who their biological parents are, and is very careful not to conceal that information. He proves this assertion specifically from Serach's case, where the Psukim provide clear hints at who her real parents are, who her real parent is. Only once her status as a stepchild is known and established does the Torah call her Asher's daughter. Therefore, only after making it known that the child is not a biological one can he be called son. One must never hide the fact that this child is adopted or a stepchild, a divorcee's child. A very weighty question is discussed in the Aruch HaShulchan. Rachel was the biological daughter of a father called Leib. She was raised by a man named Shmuel Leib and wished to go only by her stepfather's name. When she divorced, she announced that her name on the get should appear as Rachel, the daughter of Shmuel Leib. Is the get valid? Aruch HaShulchan validates it based on the fact that Othniel, one of the Shoftim, is called Ben Kenaz, despite Kenaz being only his stepfather. However, he adds that if the get still exists, the name Shmuel should be erased. So only the name Leib, the biological father's name, remains. Then the get should be resent. Discussion is obviously more extensive. Here are only one of the topics presented as relevant for our discussion.